there's a lot to get through, so we're not going to make too many introductions on this. But let's, by the way, before we go any further, it's not aliens. They didn't build Gobekli Tepe, even though some people already believe that they did. Right, okay. Now, Gobekli Tepe, I'll assume most of you don't know much about it at this time. Some of you will obviously know more than others. But we're talking about a series of sanctuaries, temples, enclosures that were used for sacred purposes, discovered in southeast Turkey in 1995 onwards through to the present day, and they're approximately 11,000 years old. The earliest ones were probably constructed around 9,500 BC. The latest ones were constructed probably up to and around 8,000 BC. And very gradually, as you'll see, they were built up on the bedrock itself, and very gradually what they call an occupational mound, a tel in Arabic or a tepe in Turkish, was gradually constructed from soil, from chippings and from human debris over a period of time. It was actually constructed on the top of a mountain, and let's point this out. It's on a mountain ridge. It's actually about 760, I think, metres above sea level. And so all of the earth that you see there, within which you see these monuments today, has all been imported to the location, because all the rest of the area around there is just pure bedrock. Okay. Right, yeah. 4 main enclosures have been uncovered so far, but they reckon that there's at least 20, and as many as 200 stones, about 59, 60, I think, have been uncovered so far that have been given numbers, and they're only just really touching the surface. I reckon it's probably only about 10% that they've uncovered so far. They've done ground penetration radar and other forms of surveys, and the place is absolutely littered with these temple monuments, which, as I said, are going to be at least 11,000 years old, probably, some of them even older than that. Now, they started to be constructed right after the end of the last ice age. And what happened was that the ice age itself had been going for, something like 30, 40,000 years. It reached a maximum around 20,000 years ago and was receding back around 15,000, 14,000, 13,000. And then around 12,000 years ago, there was a sudden re-advance, a mini ice age, if you like, which is known as the Younger Dryas. Now, you'll hear this term a few times today. Graham Hancock will be talking about it a lot later on. And this lasted for about 1,200 years, and directly after that, as I said, around 9,500, 9,600 BC, the earliest of the structures were created, which you can see here. Now, we're talking about T-shaped pillars for the most part. Almost all of them are T-shaped. And in size, they vary from about 1 metre in the smaller structures up to around 5.5 metres, 18.5 feet to the larger ones. The larger ones are the ones generally in the centre of the enclosures. The enclosures are, for the most part, not circular, but actually oval in shape, like an ellipse. Which obviously brings to mind quite a lot of stone circles around the world. The largest of the stones that are actually erected are thought to be around 15 tonnes apiece. However, in a quarry, only about a third of a mile away from there, sort of good few hundred metres, is an unfinished monolith, which is estimated to be 50 tonnes, and in size that is 7 metres in height by 3 metres in width, and there's me sitting on it there. The T-shaped pillars are covered in zoomorphic, i.e. animal and creature designs in high relief. And there's even 3D reliefs as well, actually protruding out from various of the pillars as well. And there's a whole variety of creatures represented. Most of them are very fierce creatures, like lions, and things like arachnids and scorpions and things like that. There's a number of foxes, there's various cranes and various other types of birds, some of which we'll be mentioning as we go along. And as I said, most of them are not the sort of animals that you'd want to be kept in a confined space with, because they attack basically, or bite or scratch or whatever. And there's certainly an edgy element about, these. Now, the other important point to say now is that the general consensus is that this was constructed by hunter-gatherers, as I say, at the end of the last ice age. And to be honest, it's not going to be constructed by anybody else because there was nothing else happening at this time, in theory. This is before the so-called Neolithic Revolution, where agriculture and animal husbandry and a settled lifestyle came into it. So there was only hunter-gatherers around to actually have done the work. But we'll be questioning why they actually did that work as we go along. Now, these T-shaped pillars, although they might look like roof supports, some of them are actually statues. That seems to be the consensus, and you can tell this very easily by the way that you have actually these right-angled arms that reach down the sides of the pillars and come round into the front. Obviously, Hugh was showing various images of these and other ones in other parts of the world. And obviously, you've got these T-shaped or hammer-shaped heads, and they have no faces on them. That's very interesting because the Göbekli builders, as I call them, knew how to do faces, they knew how to do heads, so quite clearly they wanted to portray this image that they did not want to show the faces, almost as if there's an ethereal or otherworldly element to what's actually going on here. They've also got collars. You can see here this V-shaped here. There are a number of them have got these collars, which are obviously the force of gravity is pulling something down. At the end of it, they've got these emblems of office, which are things like bull's heads or almost solar discs or lunar discs and things like that. So clearly these people wore pendants of some description, and they've got garments on. Now these garments, the archaeologists refer to as like a stole-like thing. You can see it on the left-hand image here. You see these vertical lines coming down and ending at the waistline. They say that it's some kind of skull, like a scarf or a stole that a Catholic priest would wear. I don't think they are. I think they are just garments, just like any garment would hang naturally and open, in this manner. And as I say, they end at the waist, where you have belts, and some of them, as we'll see shortly, actually have the belts on them. Now, these are the two huge pillars in the centre of one of the enclosures, enclosure D. And the thing about them, if you look at them, is that they're very, that their presence is there. I mean, quite clearly, as you walk into these enclosures, you're meant to walk up and come before these huge double pillars in the centre of them. And they obviously represent something. And the archaeologists have suggested, that have written about it so far, suggest that they might be the first gods, as part of some early religion. They might be celestial beings. They might be, divine ancestors or something like that. And that's, all of those may well be correct in some manner, but quite clearly there's an otherworldly presence about them. They're obviously not meant to represent, let's say, the king of the local tribe or community or something like that. There's something more etheric, more to do with otherworldly activity. And this guy here, this guy here is Professor Klaus Schmidt. Now he's the guy that we can really thank for the discovery of Göbekli Tepe. He inspected a site which had already been viewed in the 1960s and had been dismissed as a Byzantine cemetery no more than 1,000 years old. On a hunch, he went there in 1994 and realised immediately that you were dealing with a very, very important early Neolithic site. I mean, there were bits of carvings and things like that on the floor, which he recognised because he'd been working in this region anyway on other early Neolithic sites. And it's just as well because that very mountainside was actually scheduled to become a quarry. All the rock was going to be used in a major road that was just about to be constructed below. And thank God he found it when he did, because otherwise the whole lot would have been destroyed. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot of things said about Klaus Schmidt and his ideas and the rest of it, but, you know, this guy we really have to thank, to be honest, for this. Now, the reason for putting him up there is we'll come straight on to some of the meat of what we're going to be talking about here. And that's the fact that he's a very forward-thinking guy. And he said some very, very enigmatic things about Göbekli Tepe. And one of them is the fact that, in his opinion, this is somehow associated with the Garden of Eden. And I think that basically what he said was Göbekli Tepe is the Garden of Eden, although I've actually talked to him about this, and he said that it was a temple in the Garden of Eden, and he claims he was misquoted and whatever, but that's irrelevant. The fact is that this story made news all the way around the world. Has the Garden of Eden been discovered? So, is there any truth in that? Well, obviously we know that the Garden of Eden is where Adam and Eve, our first parents according to Judeo-Christian tradition, and obviously in the Quranic tradition, were before they were tempted by the serpent and suddenly realised that they were naked, lost their innocence, and God says, "What the hell have you done?" and booted them out, basically, never to return to the Garden of Eden, the earthly paradise. And from that point onwards, other than one or two exceptions, nobody supposedly has ever returned to Eden. Okay? So that's the way that it's essentially said. But there's some interesting geography associated with the earthly paradise, because it said that from there, from its actual location, the four rivers of paradise took their head. And those four rivers, which you can see here, I mean, obviously this is a representation from the 17th century of the Garden of Eden. These four rivers then water the world. Well, the Bible, the Book of Genesis, quite specifically says what these rivers are. And two of them can easily be identified as the River Euphrates and the Tigris, that run all the way from the Armenian highlands down through southeast Turkey, through Iraq, and obviously empty into the Persian Gulf. So they're two of the rivers of paradise. So quite clearly, the Garden of Eden, the earthly paradise, has to be somewhere along there. Well, in medieval times, they thought it was very close to the Persian Gulf itself. But the Armenians, the people that lived in these lands, all the scholars and academics writing about it, have always said, no, it's obviously at the other end, for the simple reason that the other two rivers, one of them can pretty easily be identified as the Arxis River that flows in from the Caspian Sea and also takes its rise in the Armenian highlands. And the fourth one's more contentious, but there are traditions going back probably at least to the 1st century AD to associate it with the Great Azab River, which is actually one of the branches of the Tigris. And that also takes its rise in the area of the Armenian highlands, in fact just to the south, within the eastern Taurus range, just below this huge inland lake called Lake Van. So this area that I've ringed here is exactly where it is. And even the map makers, right the way through to the 18th century, this is the Philip Buac map from 1783, actually shows Eden exactly where it should be. Just to the west side of Lake Van, here it says here, Eden, or the paradise, the earthly paradise. Okay? So, the fact that it's there is nothing new. I mean, it's been known for many, many centuries. But the most popular theory was that it was further south in southern Iraq, close to the Persian Gulf. And I tell you, that is wrong, I'm sorry. This unquestionably is the right answer. So that brings us into the correct area. There we go. And where's Göbekli Tepe? It's there. Okay, right on the edge of what might be seen as the earthly paradise. In fact, I mean, it's probably about 150 miles. If you went to the northeast from Gobekli Tepe, it would bring you into the heartland of the Garden of Eden, as far as I'm concerned. So it's on the edge of it. So Schmidt making that connection is a real one. I mean, there's no problem with that. And Göbekli Tepe is very close to the city of what's known today as Shamlurfa. It was actually known as Urfa, or it's the Edessa of the Bible. But also, it's the traditional site of a place called Ur of the Chaldees. And Ur of the Chaldees is where Abraham supposedly was born and hailed from. And there are shrines here, this is the Pools of Abraham, which even today are sites of pilgrimages. People come from all over Turkey to venerate Abraham at his birthplace, which is inside a cave here. And I do believe, personally, this is the real Ur of the Chaldees, even though the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, in the early part of the 20th century, discovered another city called Ur in Iraq, which then became the official Ur of the Chaldees. But Chaldeans is a word that's very important, and I'll come on to that shortly anyway. And the reason being is that very close to Ur of the Chaldees, i.e. Göbekli Tepe, only about 20, 30 miles away from there, is a very important ancient city called Haran. Right? And this is what it looks like today. Now, Haran is known as the city of the star worshippers. A people's known as the Sabians, but their actual race was known as the Chaldeans. And although the city of Haran itself probably only goes back to about 3,000 BC, it was built on the site of an occupational mound that goes back at least to 6,000 BC. And it's thought that the people here moved from another occupational mound that goes back to 8,000 BC. In other words, it's 10,000 years old. And that other first occupational mound is known as Tel Idris. Now, one of the things I didn't mention with the picture here is that one of the founders of Shamlurfa, Ur of the Chaldees, was said to have been an antediluvian patriarch of the Book of Genesis named of Enoch. And the mound, which is supposed to be the start point of Haran, is known as Tel Idris. Right? Idris is the Arabic name for Enoch. And this guy Enoch is very important not only to local traditions, but also to the story which we're telling here today. Because Enoch, as I said, he was an antediluvian patriarch, so he was of the same line as Adam and, and all that. And eventually you come to Enoch. He was the great-grandfather of Noah, for instance. And the traditional story that you'll read is that he was transported by God to paradise at the end of his life. And the vision you get is what you see here, is that the angels came down and lifted him up, and up he went to heaven. But some of the accounts suggest that he went back to the Garden of Eden, the terrestrial paradise. In other words, that this was some kind of physical journey that he actually made. And, that links him right into the area that we're talking about. So it makes sense for his life and his the foundation of the first city and the rest of it to be associated with the very area next to the Garden of Eden. Now, he's associated with the writing of one of the weirdest religious texts of history, the Book of Genesis, the Book of Enoch, okay? Now, the earliest forms of this are found within the Dead Sea Scrolls, so they probably date to about the 1st, 2nd century BC. However, they're fragments of a much older text known as the Book of Noah, which almost certainly come from oral traditions that go all the way back, basically. And what the Book of Enoch tells us is that Enoch one day was sleeping and he was visited by two angels. Now, the angels here are actually referred to as watchers. The Hebrew term is actually irim, which is a Hebrew word which means basically to watch, or those that watch, basically, which we obviously interpret in English as watchers. And they come to him, and obviously, I presume he was still awake, and they're at the end of his bed or whatever it was, and they say to him, you fancy going off with us to the seven heavens? So he said, yeah, right then. And so they take him off to the seven heavens, which, for all intents and purposes, is like a sort of air journey over this landscape of volcanoes and mountains and seas and lakes and waterfalls and all the rest of it. And amongst these seven heavens is the earthly paradise, i.e. the Garden of Eden, which is actually named the Garden of Righteousness in the Book of Enoch. And yes, the four rivers flow from there. But whilst he's there, they take him to the abode of the angels. And bear in mind, the angels guard the Garden of Eden, so they're directly associated with that. So somewhere within these seven heavens, let's say somehow geographically related, is the abode of the angels, okay, or the abode of the watchers. And he gets there, and there's a prison, a dungeon, and there's various of these watchers inside this dungeon. And Enoch says to his angelic guides, these watchers, these archangels basically, he says, what have they done to deserve that? And he is told that 200 of their number, 200 rebels, have descended and taken mortal lives, revealing the secret arts of heaven, and for which they were rounded up, incarcerated, and put in prison, and that's why they're there now. I mean, it's said that they descended down from heaven, so you get the impression of them coming down from heaven, landing on the top of a mountain which is known as Hermon, which, by the way, I do not believe is the Mount Hermon on the borders of Israel, Lebanon and Syria. Almost certainly, these stories, and there's lots of good evidence for this, originally came from the area of southeast Turkey and were transposed into the area of what is today Israel and Palestine, probably by the Israelites under Abraham, or certainly the historical version of those. Anyway, these secret arts of heaven that the Watchers are said to have revealed are all the early rudiments of civilization that were given to humankind. And it's bizarre because southeast Turkey is the cradle of civilization. It's where the Neolithic revolution began, as I'll show you now. I mean, for instance, animal husbandry, the settling down, the actual, creating of herds and domesticated animals, of pigs, cattle, sheep, goats, all began around the time of Göbekli Tepe in exactly that area, as this map shows you. The first wheat, the first domestication of wheat and rye and barley, again, all occurred in southeast Turkey. In fact, 68 modern strains of wheat have been traced back to a wild form of wheat known as einkorn that grows on a mountain called Karacadar, which you can actually see from Göbekli Tepe. And almost certainly that was the foundation point of the Neolithic Revolution. And I think it's important to point out here that Klaus Schmidt believes that Göbekli Tepe completely changes all we know about the Neolithic Revolution, because it was believed originally that the domestication of animals and agriculture came first, and that gave us lots of time to ponder over life, so we started creating temples and buildings and the infrastructure for those, and then came the first cities. This was the golden child, Neolithic Revolution. But now that's all been turned onto its head. Almost certainly the temples came first, and the infrastructure around those, and the hundreds, if not thousands of people, either maintaining them, carving, the miners, all the people involved, needed feeding, and they realised they couldn't just go out and hunt now. They had to create a source of food that was regular, and that this now created the beginnings of agriculture. So the whole thing's now been turned onto its head because of the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, which, by the way, has not revealed any evidence of domestic living. No fires, no evidence at all. It's purely a sanctuary. The earliest metalwork in the world was found in the area of eastern Turkey. It goes back to about 9000 BC, beaten copper to start with, and then smelted copper and smelted lead. A place called Cheonu, again, very, very close to Göbekli Tepe. And this is an interesting one. The earliest mirrors in the world come from southern central Turkey. Not exactly the area of Göbekli Tepe, but the culture that created them was almost certainly directly descended of it. There are two sites, one called Ashikli Hoyak and the other Çatal Hoyak, which both date to about 7 to 8,000 BC. You find the first mirrors, the first polished mirrors. They're made of the volcanic glass known as obsidian. You can see a couple of examples here. And what's so interesting about this is that amongst all these firsts that the watchers are supposedly given to humankind was metalwork, which we've seen here, began in southeast Turkey, and also the first mirrors, it says, and they gave us the first mirrors. I mean, it might be a coincidence, but is it possible that the accounts of the watchers in the Book of Enoch is actually a forgotten memory of an event in human history? You know, is it recalled in the Book of Enoch itself? And were the watchers the prime movers, the power elite, as Klaus Schmidt calls them, behind the construction of Göbekli Tepe? And did they cause their appearance in southeast Turkey, did that cause or trigger the Neolithic Revolution? Well, that is exactly what I said in a book that was published in 1996 and was written in 1994, 1995, which basically said exactly. Now, but at that point, that Klaus Schmidt was going to Göbekli Tepe for the first time in 1994. The first excavations began in 1995, and we didn't know about it until 2000. It was brought to my attention for the first time in 2000. I couldn't believe it. It was like the smoking gun of everything that I'd written in From the Ashes of Angels. I just couldn't believe it, and it was just so synchronous. And I must thank Debbie Benstead here, a good friend of mine, psychic, who was the first person that put me on to this area of the world and said, this is where you will find, you know, your elements of your lost civilization, which we felt at that time had strong links to some kind of, you know, culture, advanced culture living in Egypt. So thank you, Deb, for that, because without her, I would not have written that book. She's here in the audience today, by the way. And anyway, now, this is a great idea. I just ruined the place. That's why I get excited. Okay, because it's not just me that says this. Our good friend Klaus Schmidt said in an interview in 2007, the stones at Göbekli Tepe erected for the watchmen of the period. Watchman is one of the terms that's used in the Book of Enoch for the watchers. I mean, I've not talked to him about this, and it may just have been a coincidence, but I don't think so. He's aware of the Book of Enoch, and he knows these stories about the fact that the watchers may well be advanced human beings as opposed to, you know, incorporeal beings that come down from heaven. And there's another major clue at Haran, because one of the other books that records the story of the watchers, and probably dates to a similar period, and also been found in fragments within the Dead Sea Scrolls, is the Book of Jubilees. And the Book of Jubilees tells the story of the watchers and relates how Canaan, the legendary founder of Haran, right, which is so close to Göbekli Tepe. In fact, you can actually see the mountains on which Göbekli Tepe is from Haran, uncovered an inscription carved on a stone stela, i.e., you know, an inscribed standing stone. When translated, it was found to contain the antediluvian science of astrology as taught by the watchers. Now, I mean, that's incredible. You know, and that, to me, that's beyond coincidence. Now, the inhabitants of Haran were the Sabians or Chaldeans. The race was a Chaldean race. They were astrologers, astronomers, and diviners. And their progenitor was an antediluvian patriarch called Aphraxad, who was Canaan's father. He was seen to have been the founder of the Chaldean race itself. And they're represented there. So, in other words, is it possible that the astronomy that was eventually practiced by these star worshippers, these Sabians at Haran, whose city goes back 10,000 years to the very time of Göbekli Tepe, came from a short distance away at Göbekli Tepe itself. Well, let's have a look at more at Göbekli Tepe. Well, on the left is a stone that we like to refer to as the Vulture Stone. It's pillar 43 and it's enclosure D. And on it is this very strange vulture with these articulated arms, these huge clown feet. And there is no question that it's anthropomorphic. In other words, it has a human-like qualities. Either it's a shaman dressed as a vulture, or it's a vulture with human-like qualities. And there's various other things on here which we'll talk to as well. There's a big scorpion here, another bird, and the rest of that. And vulture imagery is one of the key things that you'll find at Göbekli Tepe and other outlying sites from the early Neolithic from the same age. There's lots of vulture imagery. So why is vultures so important here? Well, we mentioned it before, but Çatalhöyük, the first city in the world, was constructed by the descendants of Göbekli Tepe, certainly, you know, the culture that relates closest to them. And on the wall, it shows this incredible image, which is excarnation towers here. You can see these. Now, excarnation is something that's practiced, or certainly was practiced, by the Zoroastrians and their Indian form, the Parsis, and it's still practiced in Tibet today. It's known as sky burials, where the vultures will come down, pick clean the bodies, they'll go away, and then other scavengers will come in, you know, smaller scavengers, and eventually the bones will be collected up and put into what's known as a secondary or a disarticulated burial within a tomb or something like that. And this is unquestionably what is being shown here. But look, there's two different things going on here. Here you've got vultures that are attacking this headless figure. Now, as we'll see, almost certainly that represents the body being denuded. And here, on this other tower, you've got these two vultures that seem to be taking under their wing a head in this form here. Now, almost certainly, and I'm not just making this up, this is what various symbologists, whatever, say, this represents the soul, this represents the human body, and this represents the vultures will be taking it, accompanying it into the afterlife, the other world, okay? And the soul was represented as a head like this. I mean, obviously there's a skull cult associated with the early Lithic in this region anywhere. They venerate the skull and communicate with the ancestors via it. And we have the same imagery at Göbekli Tepe. At the bottom here, you have a headless figure with his arm up like that. See, no head, right? And he's on the back of this bird that could be a vulture, might be something else. It's certainly got a hooked beak. Maybe almost as if that bird's carrying this person, or the impression is taking it on board, as it were. You've got the scorpion here, but then up here, you've got this bull on the wing, almost as if it's like cupping it. Now, I've got good academic books that say that bulls were the most abstract form of the representation of the soul in the form of the head during the early Neolithic. So that is the soul being represented up here, and there's the denuded body down here. It's the same imagery at Çatalhöyük. There's the bull here. So that bull represents both the head and the soul of let's say, the deceased. Obviously, the soul of the deceased. Maybe even the unborn souls coming in would be represented. Or does it also relate to the soul of a shaman who was seen to make that same journey during ecstatic states, during out-of-body experiences, under the influence, under, altered states of consciousness? Yes, I think is the answer. Now, there's considerable evidence of shamans of the early Neolithic adopting the mantle of the vulture for ecstatic practices. Various paraphernalia has been found at these sites, particularly at places like Çatalhöyük, but also within the Zagros Mountains, whole wings of vultures have been found that quite clearly have been deliberately buried as part of some ritual act, perhaps at the end of their useful life. And this is a picture done by the British artist Alan Sorrell, works in the field of archaeology, showing vulture shamans at Chatham Hoyak within one of the so-called cult shrines with these almost like X-ray forms of vultures here. Again, you've got the headless forms. This is almost certainly representations of excarnation again, but excarnation with the view of the parting of the body and the soul. That's what this represents. It's not just there for gory reasons. It's obviously symbolic of the fact that the soul leaves the body at the point of death or during these ecstatic experiences. And this is a statue of a bird man, let's say a bird shaman, maybe even a vulture shaman from the early Neolithic, from a site called Navali Chori, not far from Göbekli Tepe, now sadly underwater. I'll just put here, note the hood, because we'll be coming back to there. Look, the hood, he's wearing a hood. Obviously some kind of headdress going on here. Now the Book of Enoch tells us that the watchers were adorned in feather coats. This is very strange. It doesn't, the original forms of the Book of Enoch said nothing about these angels, the watchers, having wings. That comes during early Christian times. But there is one very specific region and various other references in the Book of Enoch and other Enochian material that suggests that the watchers were birdmen. Does this describe the vulture shamans at the early Neolithic? Almost certainly it does. So, if these were shamans, and we'll come back to the watchers in a minute, but if these were shamans, where's their cosmic zone, as the anthropologists like to refer to, where the shamans think that they go during their ecstatic experiences? Well, I've been working for a long while with a chartered engineer by the name of Rodney Hale, who you can see here. And obviously we started to look at the alignments at Göbekli Tepe because we believed that there might be some kind of astronomical component involved, and that obviously understanding this could tell us where the shamans believed that they went within the sky world. And my colleague and good friend Dr. Robert Schock, in his book Forgotten Civilization and within various articles, proposed that Göbekli Tepe, the mean azimuth of the main enclosures, face south towards the rising of the 3 stars of the belt of Orion. And Rodney Hale checked this, and so did an Italian astronomer, and we all came up with the same conclusion. Yes, it does, but only if Göbekli Tepe is at least 1,000 years younger than what all of the radiocarbon dating is coming up. And that's suggesting dates of around 9,000 to 9,500, whereas the only way that would relate at all to Orion is if it was constructed around 8,000 BC. That's far too young. So, sorry about that. Far more of a contender is the work of Giulio Magli, and he recently proposed, and this has gone around like wildfire in things like New Scientist and magazines all around the world, that those same the mean azimuths of the twin pillars face the rising of Sirius. However, again, it's something that Rodney Hale and I have looked at in huge detail. And the problem is, and I'm not going into all of this, is that at this point in time, around 9,400, 9,500 BC, Sirius was only just rising on the southern horizon, making a very tiny arc after having been missing due to the process of precession since around 15,000 BC. And due to atmospheric extinction and various other factors, atmospheric aerosols and whatever, which have all been absolutely calculated using the professional data and values that are given by archaeoastronomers, we've done this. There is no way that this can have been almost seen. And not only that, But in 9500 BC and in 8900, when it makes just a slightly more appreciable arc, it was moving so fast that in 20 minutes it was moving 3 degrees. And also, Guglielmo Maglis worked out his calculations based on an elevation of 0.5 degrees, which is virtually invisible. And in fact, almost all the time, it would not have been seen during this period. It may have been seen on occasions down at that level. It just does not work. And we've done papers. The latest one is just gone up on my site, and which you can read. All the facts related to this are there. I mean, look, that's how bright it was compared with how it was. I mean, this is just nothing. You would not have been able to see it. There's no way that the people of Göbekli Tepe, the hunter-gatherers, would all have suddenly stopped just because this tiny speck suddenly appears on the southern horizon. It doesn't make sense that they would have created the first monumental architecture in human history for that reason. And as far as I'm concerned, looking south for the answers is not right. And that all the indications are that you enter into these structures from the south, you walk between the twin pillars, and they're directed north. There would have been a clear view of the horizon in every direction when the earliest structures were built on the bedrock. Remember, they're on a mountain top, and that the twin pillars almost certainly are pointing towards the north and not towards the south. And if that's the case, then what do we find when we actually look at these enclosures? Well, I realised last year when I went to Göbekli Tepe that they just uncovered a new stone directly in line with the mean azimuth of the enclosure D, which is the most complete, probably constructed around 9,400, 9,500 BC. So that if you stood between the twin pillars, you would be looking, if you were looking north, you'd look straight at this stone here. It's quite a large stone, about 5-6 foot tall, a hole in it about a foot across, right? And it's got these imagery around it, which I think is an abstract woman. That represents a vulva, although that's my opinion at the moment. So what would they be doing, standing between there, looking at this stone? Well, on its own, maybe it's a coincidence, but next to it is the Vulture Stone. Okay, here's the Holt Stone, there's the Vulture Stone. Now that's a clue in itself. But when we were on the tour, the Origins of Civilization tour in September with Hugh and various people in this audience, I actually discovered that there's an identical stone, or more or less identical stone, in enclosure C, which nobody seems to have ever mentioned. I mean, and it's there. I'll show you. Look, there it is, and there it is. Look, there's the stone, and it's in exactly the same position, but this one's fallen on its side. It's not been properly excavated yet. It's been numbered pillar 59, but you won't find a word about it on the net. There's nothing about it, nothing about this whole stone being there. It's the same. The holes around the same size, maybe just slightly larger, and it's on its side, and it's exactly in line with there. In fact, that's where the archaeologists have put it on the plan, and if you turned it up, it would be there exactly in line. So you've got a whole stone exactly in line, and so if you stand between the twin pillars, again, in the two oldest and most complete and most marvellous of these, you've got these holes. So what do these whole stones actually represent? You know, here's the one in D, and here's the one, to turn that on its side, in C. Well, what are they? The answer is soul holes. Soul holes, seelenloch in German, where this tradition is much stronger than it is, let's say, in Britain or certain other parts of the world. And seelenloch is the term that Schmidt uses because he also found these strange stone rings that were laying on the surface that obviously came from one or other of the enclosures and were now displaced. And he suggested that they could be soul holes. So this is not some wild idea that I've just cooked up. But he's not mentioned anything about these other ones. Now, here is examples of megalithic structures from Europe, all with so-called soul holes. and this is part of local tradition, and even archaeologists are happy to accept that these could be for the passage of the spirit from within the dolmens through the soul hole towards some kind of sky world or whatever. Okay, 4 different examples there. And this is found also within stone kists. That's from India. There's the hole there, soul hole there, so that the soul could disappear. Even within funerary urns, holes were made in the side of them. This was found in Germany, back to the Roman times. And even within the southern Tyrol today, where actually some of these dolmens are, they still actually put holes in the side of the houses that have doors that are only opened when somebody dies in the house. The tradition still continues to this day, and almost certainly the tradition goes back 7,000 years, if not more. And of course, if we wanted to extend this, the false doors of ancient Egypt are for the passage of the car, leaving the tomb, going out for wandering and then coming back into the tomb. Obviously, again, the air shafts of the Great Pyramid, almost certainly that's what they are, soul holes for the stars, probably aligned to the stars as well. And we could stretch it even further. The north doors of churches, very anciently, were seen as the direction where the soul of the deceased would go in death. They eventually became associated with the devil and were blocked up probably during the 17th century, and 90% of them or more are blocked today, and they're known as the Devil's Door. That's because they're associated with souls. Now, one of the greatest concentration of megalithic structures with soul holes is in the Caucasus, obviously not that far from Göbekli Tepe. And here you have incredible dolmens, which officially are 2,000, 3,000 BC, with beautiful carvings on, incredible monuments, over 3,000 of them that have actually been recorded, with these similar holes. Some of them are quite larger, but often you can't get through them. And these are obviously part of a megalithic culture. Now, some people suggest they're much older, but there's not that much evidence of it. And although obviously the dolmens are probably for the dead, in front of them are courts. And you can see this example here. I think Q actually showed this picture. And here's your soul hole. There's your facade or your porthole stone. And here's the wall around it. So all of the ritual activity would be done here, facing towards that. Exactly like Göbekli Tepe. And in fact, if I found out these were a few thousand years old, it would not surprise me at all. This is clearly descendancy of the same culture. No question about this at all. And these, again, are seen as associated with the soul and the passage of the soul. So what is this soul hole? Well, it comes from shamanic tradition. It's there in shamanic art around the world. It's there within near-death experiences, altered states of consciousness, lots of experiments done in modern terms, that when people are in an altered state, they will see a hole. And they'll go through this hole, and it will become a funnel or a tunnel, and it will lead you into either the underworld or the sky world. I mean, obviously, different traditions. This is from the Amazon, the Dizana shamans, drum stand, specifically done. I mean, this guy, Reichel Dormatov, has written a lot about this and basically said this is what this represents. The way is almost womb-like in appearance. And that's exactly what I think that the stones at Göbekli Tepe are all about. So let's go back to Göbekli. If you're standing between them, looking through your soul holes, what do you see? You're looking through there, what do you see during the time frame of construction? Well, enclosure D, the carbon-14 dates give us a rough average of around 9,400 BC. If you stood between the twin pillars at that time, through the soul hole, you would see the setting of the star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus setting on the horizon. And Deneb and Cygnus actually marks the position of what's known as the Dark Rift or the Great Rift, or also known as the Cygnus Rift, the opening within the Milky Way caused by stellar debris that creates like this sort of dark line down the centre of it that's been universally seen around the world, particularly in Mayan tradition, for instance, as an entrance and exit to the sky world. So, What do we know about Cygnus? Well, obviously, generally it's a bird of some description. Normally, within Eurasian tradition, it's a swan, although it can be a hawk, an eagle in different countries, bird of paradise in the South Seas, a magpie in China, etc., etc. But on the Euphrates, it's a vulture, or was originally a vulture, even though the vulture became associated with the star constellation next to it, which is the constellation of Lyra. But you'll find that originally Cygnus was also seen as a sky vulture, basically, on the Euphrates River. So this vulture represents this point of entry and exit into the sky world, marked not just by the bright star Deneb in Cygnus, but also the opening of the Great Rift. And that's what you would see if you look through those soul holes in both enclosures D and C at Göbekli Tepe in the time frame of their construction. And this seems to be represented on the Vulture Stone. The Vulture Stone is here, which I showed you before. There's the circle. There's the guy, the articulated guy with his head missing. Okay, 10 minutes to go. Oh my God. Here's Cygnus up here. Others have represented it as Cygnus. Scorpio has been identified. The Scorpion with the constellation of Scorpius. There's Horizon. It's the passage of the soul going from earth to heaven, from the Scorpio here up the Great Rift up to there. Obviously the destination of souls, the deceased, and those are shamans, the Milky Way's Great Rift, at the head of which is the Great Bird, Cygnus. Okay, and even at Chatham Hoyak, obviously where all the vulture shamans were depicted, here is one of those shrines. This is where all that vulture imagery was, here, and this is what was shown there. There's the map just to show it. It was in the north. There's no question that this is associated with the north. But who were the watchers, the power elite, or shamans of Göbekli Tepe? Well, the watchers are described as tall albinos, white hair, white and rudded skin within the Book of Enoch. Now, we're not saying that that's all of them, but that's one of the descriptions that's given. They've got otherworldly eyes, long faces, described as visages like vipers when described. Now, we're not saying they're all like this, but if we're looking for some kind of anthropological, anatomical, thing, then something's connected with this. This seems to mean something. That's why it was recorded down. Maybe there were some amongst them that looked like this, and those were the ones that were most memorable and were passed down in oral tradition. The watchers described as serpents as well. And one of the serpents of the Book of Enoch is said to be the serpent that tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden. In other words, it's not seeing it as a snake on the ground, or even one that could stand up, but actually it was one of the watchers, which obviously brings us back into the whole idea that the Neolithic Revolution is itself remembered in the story of Adam and Eve losing their innocence. Now, head deformation, obviously Q talked about this, he showed this image, went on from at least 8000 BC in the same area of Göbekli Tepe. I don't find it any earlier than this, and were these people trying to mimic earlier people who had similar heads as this? Not necessarily as caricatured or abstract as this, but head deformation is all about elitism, status within society, showing that you are different to everybody else. So were the descendants of Göbekli Tepe deliberately deforming their heads in memory of those that had founded it? And obviously much later, the Ubaid statues, a culture called the Ubaid, 5000, 4000 BC, were representing these serpent-headed figures, both male and female, with these strange haircuts or headdresses on top. Even the babies are shown as serpent. Again, is this a memory of celestial beings, the first gods or whatever, that goes all the way back to the time of Göbekli Tepe? Professor Klaus Schmidt also said that he believed that the builder gods of the Sumerian tradition, the Annunaki, almost certainly were the founders of Göbekli Tepe. He says that in his book. This is not speculation. He actually writes this down And he even speculates that the hill, the mountain on which Göbekli Tepe is built, was the role model for the Duku Mound, the Mount of Creation in Sumerian tradition. And that's also known as Karsag, and it's even referred to as Eden, bringing us right back to the story in the Book of Genesis. And this is just a representation of one of the kings venerating this Duku Mound or Karsag or whatever. So, is this what the watchers look like? This was a picture that was done in the 1990s for my book, From the Ashes of Angels, by an artist who's no longer with us by the name of Billy Walker John. She put all of the elements together and came up with this, which I still think, up till now, is probably the most iconic image of the watchers of the Book of Enoch. There's nothing else like it, really, that's been portrayed. The vulture shaman, the white hair, the pale face, the strange eyes, the elongated thing. Now, but all this was done in the 1990s, all right, before Göbekli Tepe was discovered. So, where do these watchers come from? Who are they really? Well, to take into account, we've got to now factor that there was a comet impact, almost certainly recognised now by science, 10,900 BC. Graham will be talking a lot about this. Graham Phillips will be talking about another comet event much later, but Graham Hancock will be talking about this event. He's just come back from America. He's been interviewing some of the key figures involved in this, that devastated the world during this time. Firestorms raged for hundreds of years. The megafauna of the period were completely destroyed during this time. And it's estimated that up to 75% of the human population in America, most specifically the Clovis people who created these incredible Clovis points, were destroyed by this comet impact at this time. So this is 10,900 BC. Now, I know this is a long way before Göbekli Tepe, but there's firm evidence that this wasn't just a single-day event, that stuff was going on in the world. Bad things were happening in the world for several hundred years afterwards, and that's not even to mention the Younger Dryas mini ice age, which was almost certainly triggered by this comet impact. So, obviously the global ash goes up, blocks out the sunlight, triggers the ice age. And obviously the Great Flood. It's believed that one of the biggest fragments of this comet struck the ice sheets up to 2 miles thick in North America, completely vaporising the water held within it. That water goes up into the air and starts raining down, ideally for 40 days and 40 nights, just like in the story of the Great Flood, which we got here, which, by the way, some accounts do talk about a fire element connected with it as well, fire and flood. So, almost certainly, as far as I'm concerned, this is a memory of that. And the whole story of the flood, Ararat and other sites, is all associated with southeast Turkey. So, where exactly do these watchers, these Göbekli builders, let's assume that they might well be one in the same, these vulture shamans, where do they come from? Siberia, Northern Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia? Well, originally, in my early books, I said that it was the Nile Valley, and I still stick with that because there was proto-agriculture and high culture there as early as 13,000 BC. But to be honest, I think it was just a small part of a much bigger picture. And for my new book, Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, I've discovered something quite incredible, I think, because I found a trail of a particular type of flint arrowhead which goes all the way from the Carpathian Mountains, all the way down through the Caucasus, right the way to the doorstep of Göbekli Tepe. And this culture, who we'll call here, just because for simple reasons, the post-Solutreans. And I think that they were descendants of a people known as the Solutreans. The Solutreans created incredible, sophisticated stone blades, as much as 2 feet, and in a sophistication that had never been seen. They appeared on the scene around 22,000 years ago, and then disappear around 15,000 BC. although I found that they almost certainly they continued on, and that their descendants that start with were in the area of the Carpathian Mountains, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, and that they then moved during the time of the Younger Dryas, mini Ice Age, into the Near East. And we find similarities with what's going on at Göbekli Tepe. They were the first people to use large carved blocks. These date to 19,000 BC. Look, huge stone blocks. And they made stone friezes. They put them inside the caves. It's not isolated. Various caves, these stone blocks have been found. Look, similar styles as what you find at Göbekli Tepe. No problems on the dates here. And also, recently you've probably heard that almost certainly the Solutreans got on boats during the last ice age and reached North America and were the pre-Clovis culture that eventually end up creating the beautiful blades of the Clovis people that I showed you earlier on. There's a book you must get, Across the Ice, that goes into this in huge detail. And so in other words, that the Solutrean people that were in Western Europe end up in the States, and presumably, you know, the rest of the American continent as well. These were very clever people, and in fact there's imagery in caves that almost certainly shows their boats. These are the ancient sea kings. Charles Hapgood talked about them. They're the Solutreans. There's absolutely no question in my mind that this is your lost civilization. It's the Solutreans. And we're only just beginning to understand them. Here's another one, almost like a speedboat from a cave. I think it's in Spain here. And almost certainly like the Inuit Umiak boats that they said very, very similar. And this you've probably seen from Lascaux in southern France. Obviously, it shows this birdman with this bird on a pole with here. Now, this is unquestionably been linked to the constellation of Cygnus by Professor Michael Ruckengluck of Munich University. Interpreted this whole scene as astronomical, showing the area of the dark rift, Cygnus, and whatever. And it's a fact, and I talk about this in the book, that almost certainly there was a secret society cult within the Solutreans that was focused around the bird. Not the vulture necessarily, but obviously there would have been different birds. This is obviously from Lascaux. This is from this is rock art, actual rock art from Roc des Seurs, where you saw some of those earlier stone blocks. And this is just a comparison from the Vinca culture of Eastern Europe, just to show what these abstract bird faces look. All of them, not that obviously, but these two and other examples that I give in the book. So in other words, they had a cult of the bird that seems to be associated with Cygnus. And as far as I'm concerned, they got all the way to Göbekli Tepe. They moved, probably not in one generation, but in a couple of generations, maybe slightly more, I don't know. They moved from the Carpathian Mountains all the way to Göbekli Tepe, where I believe that they became the power elite, the prime movers, motivating the local people into the construction of these monuments. Now, why exactly they motivate, I'm going to leave that today because I really haven't got time, but it's to do with the fact that it's just after a huge cataclysm and they didn't want bad things to happen again. So, what did this race really look like? You saw Billy Walker John's image of the Watcher shown earlier, and that's basically reconstructed from the descriptions in the Book of Enoch. But did these people really look like that? Well, we've put together, myself and London artist Russell Hussain, who's in the audience here, 3D sculpts based on all anatomical evidence that we can find of the post-Solutrean culture, what they looked like, what they wore, and their sophisticated garb they wore, tailored clothes. And I'm going to show you now what we believe these people look like. This is the closest I think you're going to come. Notice the very large jaws, very high, the forehead, very thick foreheads, very long. There's a female here. Obviously notice the belts, these are the belts from Göbekli Tepe, obviously shamanic aspects. Here's them in full garb. And if people say, oh, they didn't look like that, and then they did. They had this type of tailored clothing as early as 25,000 BC. Okay, these are reindeer hunters, shamans, virtual messianic figures that turned up just at the right time, and I think created Göbekli Tepe. More pictures of them here. I mean, you know, you don't want to mess with these people, do you really? And I mean, the thing is that, I mean, I'd like to be able to show you Atlantean priests holding crystals on the end of sticks to say they were the ones that founded Göbekli Tepe, but I don't actually think that's the case. They were post-Solutrean cultures. Now, here's the black and white form of Billy Walker's John, iconic image of the watch shaman, done in 1995. And Russell Hussain took this and created using all the evidence that we've got, and that's what we think they look like. That is the face of a watcher, fallen angel, Annunaki, and Göbekli builder. And just for completion, that's what we think the female looked like. Again, based on anatomical evidence, knowledge of the head deformation as well. Obviously, the ethnology is difficult to target, but there's a big influence from Asia, particularly on the area of the Russian steppes. So, you know, it's obviously big beads that you found in the early Neolithic. And that's it. Now, all of this is just in the first half of my new book, Göbekli Tepe. I'll bring in the second half next year. And it is coming out. Unfortunately, it's not coming out until May. I'm just about to be plunged into all of the editing of it over the next 2 or 3 weeks, and it's already got to be seriously updated. But it's been published by Inner Traditions. And if you like what you hear today, myself and Hugh, as part of Megalithomania, are doing tours to Turkey. Come with us to Göbekli Tepe on a voyage of discovery, to incredible sites. I mean, those here today will vouch for the fact, who went on the one this year, that it is just something that you're never going to forget for the rest of your life. And we made new discoveries, incredible new discoveries. So, and obviously, you know, Graham accompanied us as a special guest this year, and I think he loved it as well. And that's essentially it. So, you know, by all means, if anything that I've said today you want to talk to me about, contact me through Facebook or andrewcollins.com. You can email. You know, as far as Göbekli Tepe is concerned, this is new. We're discovering stuff all the time. And so any of you might have clues and answers to what's going on there. Thank you very much.